More than from the US. And for the latest, we cross to our correspondent, Nick Harper, who is in Washington D.C. A very good afternoon to you, Nick. Let's begin then with the news just in at the moment that Joe Biden has pulled ahead in Pennsylvania. I see a difference of 5,594 votes only.
That's right, it's an incredibly thin margin, but yes, within the last few minutes, Joe Biden has edged ahead in Pennsylvania. Over the last couple of days, we've seen Donald Trump's lead in the state slowly be eroded. At one point, he was up by about 100,000 votes, but now Joe Biden leads Pennsylvania by just over 5,000 votes in total. And from a percentage point, it means that he's up by 0.1%. It's incredibly close. The expectation is that there's still several thousand votes to be counted in the state of Pennsylvania, but from a Joe Biden point of view, it is likely that the majority of the ones still to be counted will be heading in his direction. They're coming from Democrat-leaning areas, in particular from the city of Philadelphia, where he has very strong support. It's one of his bedrocks within the state of Pennsylvania. So he has edged ahead, and we are expecting, as those other votes get counted, we will just see him continue to extend that lead in the state of Pennsylvania.
We're anxiously awaiting to hear, what's happening in Georgia. We're waiting for Georgia to be called. What's happening there at the moment? We do understand that should that be called, it's really quite over for the current president, the incumbent Donald Trump. We understand that that'll be tickets for him. He's out should Georgia then be called. Where are we standing at this time, at this hour, when we're talking about Georgia?
So in terms of Georgia, at about 5 a.m., so 4 hours earlier today, we saw exactly the same thing happen as we've seen in Pennsylvania. Biden just overtaking Donald Trump. And we've seen that lead continue over the last few hours, leading somewhere in the region of about 1,000 votes. It's a very, very tiny margin. And we're expecting about 4,000 to 5,000 votes in Georgia still to be counted. However, there is also a significant proportion of military and overseas votes. We are expecting those later on today. There could be as many as 9,000, but then again, it could be a smaller number. The Biden team say that they are in a very strong position in Georgia. They expect that lead to continue throughout the course of the day. But bear in mind, it doesn't matter which one of those states Joe Biden ends up winning. Either of them would give him the presidency. Pennsylvania has the largest electoral college number with 20, but Georgia has 16. Still a very significant number that would take him over the top, over that 270 magic number. And bear in mind as well that Georgia is a state that hasn't voted for a Democrat in 28 years, not since Bill Clinton back in 1998. It is a state that the Democrats hoped to be able to expand the map on this time round. They thought they were going to be able to flip it, and they feel very confident that they will get a good result in Georgia.
I want to talk about, the difference in attitude towards the elections. Just kind of assessing, all that Trump has been saying and really being quite disrespectful, if I can put it that way, of the electoral process. But we've also, on the other hand, heard from Biden, and Biden really kind of sounding very presidential. In fact, even talking about the coronavirus, something that I don't even think that Trump has even touched on in recent times. He's really been focused on saying things like that the election is rigged and so forth. I mean, what's been really, on the ground, the reaction to both men and how they've really, conducted themselves during this time of the elections?
Yeah, we saw incredible scenes yesterday afternoon. Within the space of a couple of hours, both men spoke. Joe Biden first here in Wilmington, Delaware, just a couple of blocks from here, came out and gave an incredibly short speech, just 1 minute and 40 seconds long. But he was very much setting that tone and that idea that he is ready to take on the mantle of the presidency. He talked about COVID-19, but he also talked about the vote counting, saying that it had to continue and that people needed to be patient. But he did say that he had no doubt that that he would be declared the winner. And then about 2 hours later, we had Donald Trump pop up in the White House briefing room and spend about 17 minutes, a pure diatribe in which he ripped apart the electoral system, really calling into question the integrity of this election, again doubling down on this idea. He says that he has won the election, that he has won a number of states that he clearly hasn't. It was a very clear contrast between these two men.
I mean, it does seem quite silly at this time than what we saw earlier in the week where President Donald Trump had sort of called the election. I mean, looking back now and seeing what is actually happening in real time right now, what was that all for? Why did he do that? Why did he come on that stage and, with that bravado and really tell us that, he's taken this election, he's won a second term? What was it all for?
Well, I think it's a combination of all these things. There has been that fear for several months amongst the Democrats running up to the election that Donald Trump was likely to try and do something like this on election night. He has been very much laying the groundwork, suggesting in the run-up to the election that there was the potential of fraud, and that is what he came out and said on election night in the early hours of the morning. Not just that he'd won the election, but that the Democrats were committing fraud and were now trying to steal the election from him. And that is a message that he's continued to push for the last 48 hours or so since then, very much trying to undermine the entire election system and suggesting over the course of the last day or so that vote counting needs to stop, even though it is legal for several days after the election for vote counting to continue. That happens in every single election. There's too many votes to count on election day itself. But Donald Trump is pushing this idea that the vote counting in some way, the fact that it's continuing for a couple of days after the election, is illegal, suggesting that it's being rigged in the Democrats' favour.
Yeah, I'm just worried, Nick. Is there any signs at this time of violence? During the week I've been hearing about some Trump supporters being armed in some places, and of course I've seen those chants where they've been asking that vote counting be stopped. Are there any fears, or is there any sort of sense or sort of some kind of violence likely to happen? What are you seeing, particularly there where you are in Washington? Have things been relatively calm at this time?
Well, yeah, here in Wilmington, Delaware, it has been incredibly calm, incredibly quiet. This is Joe Biden's hometown, where he's been for nearly 70 years. In Washington, D.C., we have seen some protests, not descending into violence. There have been a few scuffles on the West Coast, in Portland, Oregon, and we have also seen protests outside various polling stations where the counting is still going on. For example, in Arizona, we have had very vocal Trump supporters outside of those counting centres, and that is the other fear of the Democrats. They feared that Donald Trump would call the results into question, but there was also that fear that he would try and stir the pot, they say fanning the flames of violence, that we would have a contentious result. It may take several days for us to find out the true winner, and during that time they were worried, as we have now seen, that Donald Trump is questioning the result. And as we have this period of uncertainty, the worry is we could see some problems on the streets, with protesters going out, rallies starting peacefully, but then potentially turning violent. We haven't seen any mass violence across the United States, but of course the longer this uncertainty continues, the greater the chance of something like that potentially happening.
All right, Nick Harper in Washington, thank you very much for speaking to us. We appreciate it as always, and certainly we'll be catching up with you at a later stage. That's our correspondent, Nick Harper, speaking to us from Washington, giving us the latest of really what's happening there. And what we have said is that Joe Biden has at this time pulled ahead in Pennsylvania, a difference which is quite scary of 5,594 votes, very thin, and at a percentage, as Nick said, it's really a percentage of 0.1%, which as you can see is quite thin. So that's what's happening in Pennsylvania.